In this exercise, we're going to work on the Peter Pan collar. Now, the Peter Pan collar can be a little bit unique. There's a lot kind of going on here. So just like the basic collar, our under collar is slightly smaller than our top collar, and that's so everything can fit in. And I've done you a favor here, unlike the basic collar, which may have confused you a little bit. And if you haven't done the basic collar, you should go back and do it so that you can see what I'm talking about. You have to look at things as mirror images, and so I didn't want to correct that basic collar because I didn't want to actually do you any favors. So I wanted you to start looking at things so you can kind of understand how you should be looking at things in mirror images. Now, these two pieces, I have the under collar and I have the top collar. If we look at these things, they look very similar, but they're not exactly the same. The under collar is a slightly smaller than the top collar. It doesn't look that way because I have them flipped. So the under collar, once you cut it out this way, we flip it over to sew it together with right sides together. And that's how everything is going to be matching up. And if you can see just out here on the outside, the top collar is slightly larger than the under collar. And that's so that the top collar rolls over to the underside just slightly. So everything, all the other notches will match. Now, these collars, this Peter Pan collar has a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So when we notch for all of our notches, we have to do half of that. So I'm going to make sure that I only notch 1/8 of an inch in. So I'm going to get all of those notches clipped out right now. All right, so all of the notches have been clipped out. So there are a couple notches I want to talk about. So these notches that are here that look like they're about, this is the part that's going to go into your neckline. And these notches here identify where that shoulder seam is on the garment. So we have those two here. Now I have double notches here at this side of the collar. The double notches identify the back. So this collar actually wears from the front all the way to the back of the garment. So this goes on a child's garment, and they're quite popular for women's and girls' apparel today. So it actually wraps around from the center front to the center back, and the double notches identify which side is the back. You'll also notice that on the back side, it's a little bit straighter than in the front. So this curves away more from the front, and it's actually more straight at the center back. The other place I have double notches are over here on this pattern where we identify the shoulder. And the reason I have double notches here is to identify this as the under collar. So understand that your double notches on a collar will identify the back of the collar and also the under collar. All right, so I need to cut one of these. So this would just be a one-sided collar. If you want to do both sides, you can. You would cut 2 of each, but we're just going to do one collar. So I need to cut one of the top collar and one of the under collar out of self, but I'm also going to fuse with interfacing the top collar, just like we did the basic collar. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. All right, so now that everything has been cut out, we need to identify the face side of the fabric. Now, as I mentioned before, I've adjusted the patterns so that you don't have to worry about any kind of mirror image when you flip it over. These are both right side up, and so we can draw our lines and crosses for our face side of the fabric, because the under collar, once you put these together face side to sew them, they will fit like they're supposed to go together. Okay, so we can mark those. Now, if you were watching me cut, I know it was sped up, but I was kind of alluding to the fact that you need to make sure that you're cutting your interfacing the correct way to actually fuse it to the wrong side. Now, if this were actually two collars, you were actually making a garment, and it would actually say cut two, in which one would be flipped over. You would have to mirror that anyway, and so there wouldn't be an issue. But I wanted to make sure you cut the interfacing out so that what I was saying is that the glue sides needs to be on the wrong side of the top collar. I'm sorry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark. This is my top collar. Do you remember how I know that? Because here at the shoulder I have double notches. So this is my under collar. So I'm going to do the under collar with crosses. And now the fusible goes on the wrong side of the top collar. I'm going to flip the top collar over, and then I've got the glue side here, and now everything matches really nicely. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to press this, get this top collar fused all together, and then we'll be ready to sew. Okay, so we're ready to start assembling our Peter Pan collar. And of course, this is just one of the sides. It's a left or a right. But we have a top collar and an under collar. And we also have, this is the back of the collar right here with the double notches. And this is the front of the collar with the single notches. So what we need to do is I'm going to actually take the top collar is the piece that actually has the interfacing on it. And we're actually going to match the back and front notches to the under collar. So that's what I'm going to do right here. Okay, but I'm going to turn this over so we see the under collar. And the under collar is slightly shorter than the top collar. But look here, these edges here match at the edges of the front and the back. And that's the way we want it. But we're not going to hold this here. What we're going to do, we're going to start sewing here and just take a couple pins. I'm going to put a pin here to keep the back together, and then a pin here to keep the front together. But what I want to do is I want to match, you see I have a notch here. I'm going to pull that, and I'm going to pin that together, and then I have this other notch toward the back that I'm going to actually just pull over here and match that. Okay, so now this edge is also matching, and I'm going to put a pin here. Now, if we look, it looks a little rumply, and that's because this is bigger than, the top collar is bigger than the under collar. But once we get done with this and we turn it face side out, the top collar will roll to the underside so we don't see the seam on the outside here on the curved edge. So that's what we really want it to do. So that's why it looks a little bit like this, and we're going to have to stretch just slightly to get the under collar to match into the top collar, but it shouldn't be too bad. So I'm going to end up starting here, and I'm going to keep everything even, and the top collar will be on our feed dogs, and that will help pull the top collar together into the under collar as we sew around the edges. And then I'll probably come back here and we'll talk about the understitching of this collar, and that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. Okay, so we'll get the outside sewn together, and then I'll come back here and I'll talk to you about the understitching that you'll need to do for the under collar side. Okay, so we're ready to work on the Peter Pan collar, sew these two together. And remember, I told you that the top collar, which it has the interfacing on it, is actually larger than the under collar. So that's the side that we're going to actually put down. So that's the side that's going to go to the feed dogs, because we need to ease that into the under collar. So I'm going to start here. It's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, regular stitch length, and I'm going to start here with a back stitch, and we're going to have to guide this around at this curve, right? So I'll take this pin out, and I'm going to start with the needle down and get that tacked. All right. So now when we sew this, we have to be careful of this curve. So we're going to use both our hands, and we're going to curve around that. Now, one of the tricks, if you don't feel like you're going to make that curve, if your curve is really tight, you can actually dial down your stitching to maybe 10. I mean, a little bit. You're going to dial the numbers down, like I was at a 2.5, which is my 12 to 14 stitches per inch. If I dial down to a 2, that will give me about 16 stitches per inch. So that may give me a little bit more time to actually turn and get that curve done really nicely. Okay, and then once I get out of that curve, I can go back up to my regular stitch length. Take this pin out, and I'm matching my notches. Okay, so once I get to that notch, I'm gonna make sure that everything matches. I have a little bit here, so I'm going to just kind of a little stretch, give that a little stretch as I sew. This is the area that will need to be stretched as well. And I'm coming up to another tight curve area. So once I get to this notch here, what am I going to do? I'm going to stop, and I'm going to turn back to about 16 stitches per inch. And that will give me enough room. Those stitches will be small enough so I can actually do a good turn here. The shorter the stitches, the more time you have to make that turn. And I'm going to go back to my regular stitch length now that I'm out of that. And I'm coming up here to my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to get ready to back stitch. Right, there we go. And I'm going to take this out, and I'm going to trim. All right, so we're not quite done yet. Even though that we have this stitch line done, you can kind of see it's a little puckery, and that's okay. That's what we want, because we want the seam allowances to actually turn. We want the top collar to actually roll to the under collar. But we're not quite done yet. We need to do some understitching, and this is going to be a little tricky because we have some tight curves here. And so we need to get in there, and our understitching needs to be done with the seam allowance going toward the under collar. So that's what we're going to work on. So I'm going to do, so what we're going to do is we're going to put it in here, but I'm not going to use this foot. I'm going to switch this foot out to my narrow stitch foot. So I'm going to do that right now, and I will be right back. Okay, so I've switched out to the narrow foot here. You can see that that's much narrow, so this is the foot you want. If you're working on a home sewing machine, I'm actually not sure how narrow your foot can be. If you have a narrow foot in your kit for your home sewing machine, you'll want to switch it out, or even possibly use the zipper foot if that's a little bit more narrow. But for the industrial machine, we're going to be using this narrow foot to do this, because having the wider foot getting in here, because we're going to have to work on the inside here, and it's also going to be hard for you to see. So I've repositioned the camera as well. So remember that we want to turn the seam allowance toward the under collar, which is the side that is not interfaced. So we're going to work on that, and around these corners we see some rippling. So we don't want to trim that first. We want to actually do the understitching, and then we want to clip it. So I'm going to get this started. Let me see if I can fold this out so you can actually see in here. And I'm going to get in here right there. The nice thing is that this leg here is probably about a 1/16, maybe a little bit less than that, so we can run this seam up at the edge of this presser foot. So we just want to be about a 1/16 away from this seam. So let me see if I can get ready for this, and then I'll get out of your way so you can see me. Again, I'm pulling this away, and I don't think I'm going to backstitch just because I need my hands. It's not that big of a deal right now to backstitch for this because it's all going to go into a seam allowance. So I'm just going to stitch, and I'm just going to have to work it. You see how this is folding over right here a little bit? We just want to pull that away. See if we can continue to do that. And this is going to be tough. I know it's tough for me, but the idea is that you're just pulling it away enough and not getting any puckering. And I know it's looking a little bit hard for you to see that. I'm just trying to pull it away from so you can actually see it in the camera of what is happening in here. So once we get around the first curve, it will kind of be smooth sailing because it's a longer seam. But when we come back up here to this curve, it's going to give us some trouble. So we have to kind of get ready for that. And what I'm trying to do is just kind of pull the two sides of the collar away from each other, and so that it doesn't, if I can get in here so you can see that. I know it's going to be hard. Now I'm going to have to sew and take a chance because I can't, this is the curve, and I don't know if you can see that. So when I fold it, it doesn't give me very accurate view of that for you. Sometimes you kind of have to let it sew and pull it away as you're holding it, while just trying to make sure that you're not getting any puckering. And I'm coming back up to the end. Okay. Clip these threads. I know you're probably saying, well, if you had a hard time with it. And the only hard time I had with it was trying to keep everything so you could see it. So this is what it looks like on the inside, right? All the way around, 2 rows of stitching, right? And then we'll need to come and clip these. And I'm going to pull back. I won't pull back on the camera. Let me turn this right side, face side out so you can see what this looks like right now. All right, so this is our stitch line all the way around. It looks a little bit rumply, but once we get in there and we clip and then we press and then we match out this seam up here, then everything will roll over and look really nice. So we're going to do all of that at the press mat. So if you've got this far with doing this understitching as good as this, you're in really good shape. Okay, so we're all ready to finish up the Peter Pan collar, and it looks kind of bulky and puckery right now, but once we turn it to the face side, that will all go away. So remember about our facing on our other curves. Instead of clipping it in certain places and doing triangles and things like that, we're not going to do that on this one. We're actually going to trim very close to our understitching. So I can actually see it better on this side. We just have to make sure that we're not going to get the top collar, which is the interfacing side. So I'm going to clip here. I'm going to trim on this side very close to that seam, because as long as I can't see the stitching, then I'm not hitting that stitching. So I'm just going to trim close. And what this is going to do is that we're actually cutting away all of the rippling parts of this collar, right? Oops, I got a bad clip there. It looks a little weird. I'll come back and fix that. I'll show you what I mean in just a sec. I'm still just clipping all of this extra seam allowance off. Make sure that this doesn't buckle over so that you don't cut any of the collar. Okay, so right here is what I meant. That looks a little not so pretty. So I'm just going to trim those off, make it a little bit prettier. Okay, so we're still looking a little bit puckery. Let's turn this to the face side. So this is the under collar with the under stitching, right? And what that is going to do, we need to make sure that this edge up here, those meet. And I can put a couple of pins there to hold that up. The reason is because that's how we know that everything is going to be, the top collar is going to be rolling over to the under collar, right? So I'm going to press it from the top side. Now, if you have a finer fabric that might burn, you'll want to use a press cloth for this part, but I'm just going to press it, make sure that that top collar is actually rolling to the under side, right? And you can clearly see that the top collar, is right here on the edge over. That way we don't actually see that seam on the outside. So now I'm going to label this Peter Pan collar with understitching, the date, and my name, and it's all ready to go into the notebook.